the friendship is sharing deal.
Because I want one of your McNuggets.
And I need some of your Quarter Pounder.
There's a deal for everyone at McDonald's. Get one favorite like 10-piece chicken McNuggets, a Quarter Pounder, or a Big Mac and get another for just $1. Price and participation may vary. Valid for item of equal or lesser value.
Historia Canadiana is recorded on the unceded lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka First Nation.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Historia Canadiana, the show where we talk about literature, history, and culture in this snowy but warming up land that we call Canada. Today, we have a very special guest on the show, one who is a public speaker, best-selling author, educator, and accomplished artist who focuses on raising awareness about Indigenous realities. She is the co-author of the award-winning children's book, I Am Not a Number, where she shared her granny's experiences as a residential school survivor in Canada. She is a certified teacher and learning strategist and holds a bachelor's of arts in history and visual arts, a master of education in special education, and a doctorate in educational leadership. She is a member of the Nipissing First Nation and lives in Toronto, Ontario. And we are happy to have on the show Jenny Kay Dupuis. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
We're here to talk specifically about a new book that you're writing, or that you were publishing, I should say, in 2023 called Berry Bling. So can you start by telling us a bit what this book is about and what it is for someone who might not know about it?
Certainly. So Berry Bling, it's a children's book that tells the story of a young girl named Maggie. She's a young Anishinaabe girl, and she makes her first ever beading project, a pair of earrings, while visiting her granny in the city. However, she finds it more difficult than she ever expected. Granny shares her story of how beading really helped her cope through a really painful part of her life and also yet stay connected to her Anishinaabe culture, especially after she lost her First Nation status and was forced to leave her community. Maggie discovers through her time with Granny, about Granny's teachings, that beading is this journey where they sew or stitch together memories and life lessons, and they learn about things like perseverance and persistence and even Indigenous joy.
Absolutely. And you weave all of these elements together of beading and community building and learning about your heritage. And kind of behind all of this is the Indian Act, right, which is this major piece of legislation in Canadian history, which still has an impact, obviously, to this day. And before we get into the details of this book, I feel like it might be important to actually define, perhaps, what the Indian Act is and why it might have an impact to this day and on the book that you wrote.
Certainly. It was really important that I incorporated the Indian Act, especially for young children, because it's often not talked about. And also the impact that it's had on women and children, especially over the years. So the Indian Act itself is a Canadian federal law that was passed back in 1876. And it's been changed or amended many times over the years. But the Act itself, it really defines how the Canadian government really interacts with First Nations and Indigenous peoples in Canada. And the Act really gives, when you think about it, the Act really gives the Canadian government a lot of power, and it has over the years to control, particularly First Nations, their people's identity, culture, when you think about the land, access to the land, and even access to resources. And it's affected everything. Like, there's many stories that exist out there. My previous book talked about, the residential school system. That piece is actually buried in the Indian Act. I remember growing up and hearing stories from my father about some of our relatives having to get permission to leave the reserve for various reasons. But it also controlled even how community members can participate or not participate in cultural practices and ceremonies. But that list goes on in terms of what's in the Indian Act. And it continues to be something that's important because it still governs that relationship between Canada and Canada's government and also First Nations and Indigenous peoples in Canada. So it's important we understand, what's changed over the years within the Indian Act and what still exists today, and also the impacts that it's had on people overall from the communities.
one of the things we've talked about the Indian Act on the show before, and one of the things that we brought up was specifically its legacy of gender discrimination, which is something I don't think a lot of people perhaps recognize, or at least is at the forefront of a lot of people's minds when they think Indian Act. They think, well, just general discrimination against Indigenous people, which is true in some sense, but it also is a bit more complex than that, of course. So, can you go into a bit more detail as to what the Indian Act's legacy of gender discrimination is and how that perhaps plays in your book specifically?
So there's a section within the Indian Act. There's many sections within the Indian Act, but one in particular was written, and it contributed really to the marginalization and oppression of First Nation women, their children, and also their communities as well too. And it really disrupted a way of life where First Nations women often played this central role in communities, prior to the Indian Act, when we talk about the communities, but playing a central role within communities, but also playing a central role within families. And they were really respected for their gifts that they brought and that they carried, and the teachings that they carried and were given as well too. But the act, within that act, it did something to remove some of the women from the communities. It said, like those that were First Nations women that married someone who was not First Nation would have their status terminated. So this was not a community decision. This was a Canadian government decision. And through this act. And as a result of having their status terminated, they had to leave their communities. They could no longer remain, really, right? So they were denied their rights and opportunities if they married out. So they lost their connection to their land. They lost the connection to their community resources. Their impacts on no longer having the same type of access to healthcare or education or housing. That was all shifted and changed. But conversely, why it's important, why we say it's gender discrimination, is because it never happened to First Nations men who married out, who married somebody who was not First Nations. In fact, those women who were not First Nations got status for a period of time, and received all of those, access to all of those things that I discussed that women lost, or that First Nations women had lost. So for me, it was so important to tell this story. It was so important to tell this story because, I don't think a lot of people really know the true impact that it had. And it had an impact on, thousands and thousands of women right across Canada. And it still impacts us today when we think about it in terms of, the outcome of this.
Absolutely. And if you'll let me read a passage from the book in this case, there's like a really, I think it's a central part of the book in this case that kind of gets to the heart of what you're describing here, where the main character is talking to her grandmother and they're looking at pictures together. And at some point, I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the main character's name right now as I'm opening up the book. Sorry about that.
So it's Maggie?
Thank you, Maggie. But she says here, I notice an old photo buried in the stack. Who's this? That's me, back when I lived on the reserve. Granny never talked about living anywhere but the city. I married your grandpa, she explained. He wasn't First Nations. So back then, under the law, I was stripped of my Indian status and had to leave the community. Wait, so you weren't First Nations anymore? I was still Anishinaabe. I am Anishinaabe. But because of one section of the law called the Indian Act, I was forced to move away. I couldn't practice my culture or speak my language in the same way. I left everything I knew. So obviously this whole back and forth, it really talks about what you're saying in this case. I do like the inclusion as well of Granny never talked about living anywhere but the city, which is something that, a lot of Indigenous writers and educators talk about these days, of like the transition towards more industrial life. And I think that's one of the things that I really appreciated about your book is you kind of allude to all of these different issues without necessarily having to go into that much depth into them, right? Because it's a children's book and you're limited on page space. Of course, you can't talk about everything, but I really did appreciate these moments that still refer to a wider set of issues that Indigenous people face today. And I just wanted to mention that. So I'm curious. So obviously these are not light subjects, right? The Indian Act is a heavy mark on a lot of communities to this very day. And I'm curious what brought you to approach this topic through the lens of a children's book, which generally people see more as something that's a bit more lighthearted or educational in a different kind of way than you might see in a history book, for example. So can you tell us a bit about the thought process behind that?
I've actually been thinking about writing this since I was about 15 years old. So I'm going to say many, many, many years. I've been thinking about writing about this. I wasn't really sure how to do it or how to approach it. Especially, I never thought I'd be an author. Let's state that first, right? So it's like, how do you tell this story? Because to me, it's a story that I lived, so to speak, right? The Indian Act actually discriminated against my family in real life. So my grandmother lost her status for marrying a non-First Nation man. So it affected her children, like my father, and it affected the grandchildren like myself, and it affected a generation, below me too, as well too. So I grew up basically visiting my grandmother every weekend. My father brought me. So when you think about the book, there's this girl Maggie. I'm not going to say it's me, but there's things that have been I've taken or I've drawn from in my own life lived experiences. Driving in the car, pulling up to my grandmother's house in the city, and climbing that big staircase. And that's what I did in this book, right? I recreated that. And that knock on the door, and the first thing you do when the door opens, you walk in, and my grandmother would be talking to her sister on the phone in Anishinaabe-Moan. I didn't know it was Anishinaabe-Moan though, because at the time, right? In terms of her traditional language. So I was taking bits and pieces, and I wanted to recreate that because there were so many things that I couldn't understand, right? And growing up, and it took me a long time to piece everything together, really. And then, when you learn about, you watch at the time when everybody's getting their status back. So when my grandmother got hers back in 1985, and my father got his back, I remember sitting in her, her living room and then having discussions about this and what they need to do to apply, and et cetera, et cetera. And there you are as a kid wondering what's going on. But I still didn't get my status back until 2011. So I lived in my home community of Nipissing First Nations for a number of years. But that at some point, that's technically, even though it's your community and your home, you can't stay. So you have to make the decision to leave, so to speak, right? And we lived there because my father had the status at the time. So what it was is I imagined all these kids, and I knew these kids too, growing up, because some of them were my relatives and stuff. And it's like, we couldn't verbalize in a lot of cases what had happened or understood what was happening, because we're not taught about it in schools at all. It's not discussed at the time, at those time periods. And then you start thinking about identity and what that means to your own identity. Like, who are you, right? Like you're kind of like in the middle of trying to figure out who you are. So I thought it was so important to write a children's book about this. And when you think about, that experience of loss and separation from your home community and culture and everything that you know or should be able to know, I think a book like this can help, those many people that are still lost, or those people that did find their roots again, or just those that don't know about that period of history, and I could really offer some support too.
Totally. And do you feel like, this is not one of the questions I planned, but as I'm speaking about it, do you feel like you have a specific target audience in mind? Are you aiming for Indigenous children in this particular case to read it, or do you feel like this is more open to a wider audience for different reasons?
When I wrote I Am Not a Number, so that was a book about my grandmother's residential school experience in Northern Ontario, it was really intended for my community as a cultural documentation, so to speak, right? And then it opened up as I started to share the book around, and it was, for school children for sure was a target audience, but it became something that was more in terms of even for adults and community groups, for teachers, even with their professional learning and such. And I'm imagining a book like this would have a similar effect or similar impact, especially for people trying to figure out how to explain gender discrimination in the Indian Act. It could be a good introduction. It could also be a really good introduction for people that are thinking about like coping skills and talking about, persistence and perseverance and those concepts of how to care for yourself and others. Because as Granny and Maggie Bead together, make these beautiful heartberry earrings. There's those lessons those life lessons that come on how to find joy when things are really, really tough, right? How do you get past that? And there's literally all the steps that are buried in. I'm not sure if people have even realized it, but within that process of learning to bead and how it closes off about finding truth and all that kind of stuff. So
can you speak a little bit more to that, actually, that whole process? I know we're not quite at the part of talking about the beading, but I'm curious to know more actually about this whole process, like you're saying, because it's not something that I was much aware of.
Yeah, so the book does focus on having that Granny and Maggie sitting and having that conversation about Granny's past as they're going through old photographs. But they're trying those old photographs were found amongst at a time when Maggie and Granny were trying to find a beadwork design to make. And Maggie does pick out these beautiful heartberry earrings and says, can I try these? Can we make these together? And Granny says, well, we can try maybe a simpler design, but we'll give it a shot, kind of thing. Maggie, when she's going through, she's learning to bead and realizing it's way more difficult, right? And you think about, and I'm thinking about it too, when I learned, the part about the beadwork is not actually a reflection of my relationship with my grandmother. So I didn't learn to bead from her, but I learned to bead from many other people in various communities, including my own. But I thought I pulled together all of those experiences in the sense that, you think beading is going to be really easy. And a lot of students that I work with too, over the years that I've worked with, think it's really easy too. But when you sit and do it, there's a lot of things to learn in terms of the intricacy of the artwork, right? But with the heartberry earrings that they're building, Granny's teaching her about, the story of the heartberry, the strawberries, in our communities, and the idea how we can use it to, to find truth and deal with truth, and also to cope, how to cope with things that could be really difficult. And to also think about how you can care for yourself and care for other people. So the lessons are built in within as they work together, right? So through their conversations. And I thought that was so important because you think of so many young people, regardless whether they're Indigenous or non-Indigenous, that sometimes you just want to give up. There's frustrations in life, whatever that looks like. And, here's something that they could attach, or learn from, right, with the lessons drawn from the heartberry earrings. And in the end, she works through it, and she builds these beautiful heartberry earrings, and she experiences pride, and we call that Indigenous joy in our communities, right?
I really like that scene. I don't have the page up right now on my computer, but that scene where Maggie pulls up the string, she's like, oh, look, this is nice, and all the beads fall out on the ground, and it's this moment of realization that, oh wait, I can't just do whatever with this. And I found myself laughing quite hard at that little moment right there. It was cute. But before we get into the beading a little bit more concretely, I just want to ask one last question in this case, or a few last questions about the book. And I'm curious, did the act of writing a book that's specifically for children in this case, or younger audiences, change your outlook on Indigenous affairs in Canada and how they can be approached or perceived, or not really in this case? Did you already have a certain sense that you then adapted to children's books?
I've worked for a number of years, so I've been really immersed in Indigenous affairs since I was very young, like a teenager, really. And as you mentioned earlier in my bio, I have a doctorate in educational leadership, and I've completed academic research, and I've taught, and I've done a lot of advocacy work. And my focus has mostly been on adults, but you kind of realize that there's this power that comes in story work, particularly a storybook. And I've learned that I didn't learn that right away. And I started seeing over the years, as I was reading books about children's books, storybooks about, let's say, the Holocaust and other lived reality issues that existed right around the world. But you kind of realize for young people that you can talk about you can talk about history, you can talk about lived experiences, and have it can be a really powerful realization for them. So, when you ask that question, did it change my outlook on the state of Indigenous affairs? I think I realized that, young people can take in and learn about it When people say that they can't learn about laws, young people can't learn, like 6 years old and stuff like that. They can, in fact, right, if you do it in an age and grade appropriate way. So it changed my outlook in terms of who I could reach out to, right, with sharing and educating. That it's not just adults for these types of conversations, and the young people understand the difference between what's right and wrong, and can have an opinion on it too, and start thinking about how they view the world around them too.
Absolutely. I remember having that realization about children's literature when I saw that Bell Hooks wrote children's books as well. And that just kind of blew my mind, because I had known Bell Hooks as this really important cultural theorist and, critic and so on. And suddenly to see that she wrote children's books approaching these really complex topics about, Blackness and Black lives in North America, and that just kind of blew my mind that that would be possible for children, because I'm not someone who does a lot of work with children in this case. So, but yeah, I totally agree with you in this case, and especially the idea that children can learn. Like, there's a reason why we say that their brains are sponges, right? They can just absorb an impressive amount of information that constantly surprises me. So yeah, absolutely. And I'm curious in this case. So this is obviously an illustrated book as well as a written text, right? And I'm curious, I remember asking this question when I had Richard Van Camp on the show, when he was talking about a comic book that he was re-releasing in this case. And I'm curious, right? Are you involved in the artistic side of the book as well as the writing, or is it something that you kind of leave to the artist in this case, whether you're working on this book or in previous books like I'm Not Your Number?
With both books, actually, I was very involved, heavily involved, when it came to working with the illustrator. I was fortunate both times to be involved in the search for the illustrator. So I was really fortunate in this case. We came across Eva Campbell. I had something. I'm not only an educator and author, but I'm also an artist too. And I used to teach art too, but I had a really specific style in mind that I wanted to go with this book, something that, I was imagining sort of like watercolor type images, soft kind of colors and brush strokes and stuff, and as well as something that was really almost a feeling of nostalgia to a degree. When you look at the different, when you look at the actual specifics of the illustrations, you'll see what I mean. But the illustrations really did play a really big, crucial role in this, and I'm really thankful to Eva for the way that she walked with us through this process. So we worked closely with her, and it started off with, when I write, I often at the same time put in the margins notes of how I see things, right? So when I talk about, the couch that Granny and Maggie are sitting on, and it's covered with a crocheted blanket that Granny made, and the importance of that. So she sits carefully on it, but she sits on this couch also with that Granny bought with her bingo winnings, which was true in my grandmother's case. But when you think of the way things looked, right, like the old telephone or the plants all over the place and those kind of things, right? I at the same time I put those notes in the margin, so that I know that it's not just me writing a story, but it's also thinking about how this is going to look. Even thinking about like links to photographs or whatever the case is, popping those into. I gave her a photograph of the outside of my grandmother's apartment building that still actually stands today in Northern Ontario, and so she can draw on those experiences. But not only receiving those notes and those reference photos, but also going back and forth through emails and discussions of clarifications, of like, oh, I want the fry bread to look a bit more this shape, or like put some chili on the bread, kind of more chili on the bread, and that kind of stuff, right? Or thinking about coloring, and the characters themselves were something we spent a lot of time with, because thinking of drawing on from my what Granny should look like, and thinking about her shirt with the flowers all over it, and kind of like imagining polyester type pants or those kind of things, right? Like, or her hairstyle, and then thinking of Maggie and what a little girl might look with a hooded sweatshirt, and those kind of things, and also thinking a lot about color too, the color choices, and then also thinking about the way that the beadwork should look and how it should lay on a kitchen table. And then sending reference photos about that with that too. So it's really important to be able to work in this particular case, because I keep on using the word cultural documentation, but books to me, especially those that involve Indigenous cultures and knowledges, they're cultural, it's documentation. So for me to work closely with Eva and her learning a lot about it too. She's non-Indigenous, however, she worked so carefully with it. And it's important to have that type of relationship, especially when we talk about reconciliation, and also when we're talking about reclamation of culture as well too.
Absolutely. And yeah, I do find it interesting that, as a visual artist yourself, you would have these insights into how to actually construct and depict a lot of these images onto the page in very specific ways that I think a lot of writers wouldn't necessarily have, right, if they don't have that particular insight. But yeah, it's interesting. It adds an extra dimension of care, I guess, to the book. Yeah, very interesting.
Thank you.
So getting specifically into the beadwork, and I guess we already started a little bit talking about this, but I'm curious to hear for you, like what the cultural significance of Indigenous art forms like beading, right? Like what that would what kind of impact that would have on a community, and what is the specific cultural significance of beading in this case, and how does it help build family or community relationships?
I think when it comes to Indigenous art forms or Indigenous artwork, I think of it really as helping us to really reinforce our cultural values and our identity, recognizing that when we look at Indigenous art forms, it's very diverse, amongst communities, amongst nations, and it's important to recognize that. And it's also important to recognize that a lot of our artwork was suppressed or even lost over the periods, whether it was the impact of the Indian Act saying, hey, you can't do this, or just the idea of historical trauma, or people that, didn't have the opportunity to learn it because they were removed from community. When we think of the residential school system, or we think of various other acts that were put on people in our communities. But when I think of, that love for beadwork that still exists in our communities, and you see it all over social media, like if you go through Instagram and look at the beadwork and the beautiful work that people are sharing, it really plays a role when we look at family and community relationships. In some cases, it's also communal activities as well too. Like I've participated a lot, depending where I've lived, where you spend your weekends literally sitting around tables with community members, and they share the stories about the culture and the history and their experiences, and they pass on the traditions of they even talk about why they use certain designs and the stories that come with those designs as well too. And I talk a little bit about that in the book as well, as Granny sort of shares her different photos and where she gets her inspiration from. So those are conversations that have that do take place, and it can really help to, when we think of art forms, it really helps to strengthen our ways as well too. So, and passing on important knowledge and teachings. So for me, it's important and it's significant, and it really helps to help us stay connected.
I remember I went, was it last year? Yeah, I think it was last year. I went to a powwow in Kanesatake, not far from Montreal, for listeners who might not know. And it was interesting because there were some stands that were selling beadwork and so on. And I remember we had asked, like, oh, is there any kind of significance behind these particular images that were being beaded or anything like that? And I remember the person telling us, well, the image is not necessarily, right, that they can be whatever sometimes. Sometimes they are culturally specific, but other times it's just, a strawberry is just a strawberry sometimes.
Yeah.
And but what was important to remember is like the actual process, as you were saying, behind it, and the actual act of getting together and beating all of this was what was being emphasized in this case by this particular maker and artist. And that kind of stuck to me. And you saying that reminds me of that, and I find that very important to underline in this case. It's more than just surface level images being important, right? It's about the journey, so to speak, that you go on.
That's right.
Yeah.
And then for Maggie and Granny in this story, it was definitely the journey, right? Because,
Yeah.
and then Maggie also learns that, as they sew together, they sew the beadwork, or they stitch it together, that with what exists in there is those memories and those lived experiences and those histories. It all comes together and lives within that piece. So it's for Maggie, a little girl, it was when she wore those earrings, it was more than just putting on a pair of earrings, that there was, her grandmother's histories living in there, and her grandmother's lessons as well, and teachings. So,
And I guess extending from this, right, a lot of Indigenous writers and artists today really, and communities in general, focus on the act of storytelling, right, as being very important to perpetuate traditions and history and culture. And I'm curious how you see that play out, perhaps in your book, of the importance of intergenerational storytelling, and if it relates specifically to Bead in any particular type of way.
for me, I think I just look at the idea of storytelling in general as an opportunity, and I keep on using that word all the time and time again with cultural documentation, right? When you think of passing on those stories and that relationship that Granny had with Maggie, right? The importance of that relationship taking place, and to show, how they care for each other, and how they have, empathy for each other. And I also threw the father in there too. I don't talk a lot, like it's the father kind of drops her off and then picks her up, but that to me is also important, having that male figure, because I think a lot of times people assume that, or in the past I've heard a lot of stories where people say it's, recognition for the mother, but the reality is, in the case of my own life, I did have, my mother and my father both raised me, but my father played a very, very big role in trying to, in his own way, keep us connected to family, no matter sort of where they lived. So in the case of my grandmother being in the city, and dropping me off to visit, or him staying with me too, and spending that time, but I wanted him present in that story, and it actually looks like my father too. The image, we gave him a role, so
That's awesome. And one of the things that I'm curious about, right? So we were talking about storytelling in this case, both as a general form and specifically for its importance to history and cultural practice. And I'm curious, right, outside of storytelling, what kind of other actions do you see as important, right, in order to face the legacy of the Indian Act, like you do in this book?
I think that when I think of this book itself, I think that there's other actions that can be used, beyond like storytelling, but also it's important whether there's a commitment to education. I think overall, you can have all the resources and supports out there, but you really have to have people who are really committed to education, who are willing to educate and really pick apart that Indian Act, take the time to pick, different sections, and take the time to discuss them and figure out the legacy that it has even today. And whether education looks at, educational campaigns, you see a lot nowadays of the discussions of the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. That's, the root of that is definitely oppression. When we talk about discrimination, etc., and the violence against women. But some people say that the impacts of when we break apart the Indian Act, that there could be perpetuating some kind of we could be setting up for violence. So we have to be really careful of how we unpack that. We understand that, and how we draw connections too. So when we think about sort of education campaigns, I think that's important, of how people can talk about that. I brought that up because to me it's a current issue. When we talk about women, and I talk about the Indian Act, like I'm very specific with gender discrimination in the Indian Act, and I talk about the oppression and stuff. But I just want people to realize that that's not the end of it. What happened in the Indian Act when it came to oppression against Indigenous women, or even First Nation women too, that it's something that's ongoing. So that's why I brought up the missing and murdered, and I even talk about think about what happens what we need to do in terms of educating about current issues to past issues, even how we can do it through revisions to school curricula. We've spent a lot of time, taking the time to talk about residential schools and how we can include that pretty much right across Canada when it comes to curricula. But we also, I think, have to make room for these type of discussions as well too. And thinking about professional learning and supports across various sectors, and how that would look in terms of education, whether it's health sectors, thinking of how the women have been impacted, and the children, thinking of the justice system, and also thinking of education system, and that list goes on. So education to me is it's so important when we want to face the legacy of the Indian Act, and also to support those people that have been impacted over the years and how it's changed their lives literally.
Absolutely. And yeah, very important to underline this. I think if people take anything from this interview, I think that's definitely important, right? The issues go on much, much further than what we're talking about in this case. Definitely.
Yeah. You know what? I'm even thinking when I talk about the missing and murdered, it even goes deeper than that. It extends to that too, because we think of even gender discrimination that exists for women, even in the workplace, and et cetera, for Indigenous women and what they face, in the education system, and the list goes on. So it's being conscious and aware of how we can educate each other and work to change our practices.
Absolutely. And on a last question, in this case on storytelling, right? We brought this up a little bit earlier when I read out a part about the city that Granny lives in. And another aspect of your storytelling, again, is this idea of mentioning something just in passing, but that has so much to unpack in it. And right at the start of your book, you mentioned, and this is something that you brought up, that Granny speaks a little bit of Anishinaabe. Anishinaabe Moan. And it's interesting because Maggie mentions in the narration, right? I don't speak it, neither does my dad. It stopped at my granny, and I still try to understand. And I'm curious to hear you speak a little bit more about this language gap that exists from one generation to another, how this plays out, perhaps in your own experience, and how this is something that has a wider impact with the legacy of the Indian Act, for example. Like, why would this have stopped at Granny?
So that actually was taken from my own lived experience. I think I had mentioned earlier in the interview that every time I'd visit my grandmother, she'd always, be on the phone in the kitchen with her sister, and be ending the phone call with her, and she would be speaking Anishinaabe. I didn't, and as I said in the book, like literally that comes from my own words. Technically, like I didn't speak it, right, and neither did my father. And I talked with my father about that when I was writing the book, and it was just the idea that, my grandmother experienced the residential school system, where it was not promoted or encouraged the language. And, her other experiences, she did face a lot of racism in her life and stuff. So it was a choice not to pass on the language, because she was, because of her own sort of like the worries that, she had faced so much racism and oppression and stuff, and discrimination. So she didn't want to pass that on, and so my father never picked it up. Some other family members, like extended family members, I did, but you lose that language, right? And it's not passed on. But it's so important. I think I've never had the opportunity to study the language or to learn it, but I do know people that are young people, like they are taking the time, whether it's available in schools now or available through community learning and such. It's there, but it's part of reclaiming what's lost and taking back what's lost, with what was in that Indian Act to strip away the culture and language and such, and now you have these resilient people that are standing up and resisting this, and also the idea of just trying to reclaim and revitalize and find pride and find understanding of the culture through the language and what's taught through that, recognizing it's not just the language, but the teachings that come along with it at the same time. So I thought that statement to me, even though it's like only a line or two, and you have Granny sort of on the phone, the picture, it's actually, I think to me, it's a powerful statement of what, the legacy of the Indian Act and the legacy of what was taken away in communities. And people just to think, having a quick snapshot of why did that happen, right? Think about it, like, and it's a conversation that a teacher usually could have, or a librarian or a community group could have, to say, like, to explore that deeper. And I think that's what I do with my writing sometimes, is I put little tidbits in there, thinking like, okay, I can't say it all, but I can maybe put a line or something in here, and try to make it flow. It's just like that conversation that I had, what you read earlier, that passage between Granny and Maggie. Like, some people are saying to you, how do you write about the laws? Because you can't. Like, they're saying, like, you can't teach young kids about the laws. And it's like, yeah, you can. But there's a technique that you can use within writing for children's books, and the idea of, using chunking information and using that conversation of going back and forth, two very relatable people, that Granny and that, that kid, having that conversation and asking questions and showing empathy and such. So
just the implication, right, of that line, I still try to understand, in this case, comes back to what you're saying about a lot of the younger generation of Indigenous communities wanting to go forth and learn that language. I think was it in Tayake Alfred's book Wasase? I think he brings that up, of saying that a lot of that younger community, when he was interacting with them, they were the ones that were most engaged, right, in Indigenous resurgence, right, as he was talking about it. And I really feel like that gets to the heart of what you're talking about in this case. So definitely an important, yeah. So getting to the I'm always curious in this case, and this is one of the last questions I have here. I'm always curious about the publication realities in Canada, right, for different people. And considering the subject matter in this case, which is highly specific and very difficult, right? I'm curious, did you have any difficulty with getting this book published, or getting any interest in publication? And yeah, I'm just interested to hear more about how that whole process played out.
So in the end, I was very fortunate. It didn't take long to actually get a deal on it when I did start sharing with publishers. But the biggest challenge, though, when you send it out, because I sent it out to literary agents and publishers, and the issue was the length of the book, right? Everybody has this, like, the average picture book has this many words, so I could bring it down to 1,000 words. Well, it's 2,200 words, and I'm not willing to budge, right? So it's like, I'm just going to sit with the story until someone eventually takes it, or do something else with it. Who knows, right? So I wasn't too worried. But what bothered me really was, and I say this because, being told it's the length of not, it's not the length of a traditional picture book, and being told by literary agents and being told by some publishers about it, that they only publish so many words. I think that, to me, is like, that approach, I'm sure they have a reason for it, right? Like, in terms of maybe financials or whatever the case is. But when you're willing to support, and you're looking to support diverse books, especially when it comes to reclamation of cultural knowledge, or an opportunity for, and I'll use that word again, cultural documentation, you really need to go outside, think outside of the box, or be willing to support outside the box. And there's no way that a publisher cannot do that if they really truly believe in Indigenous stories. So, and I didn't want to push back on it, because, that length, if I took that out, if I stripped those words out, I'd be taking out cultural context and very detailed descriptions. Like, I wanted to describe that beadwork and that process, that idea, the way that needle moved, and the way that, her hands moved, and the frustrations that she had, and then also the lessons that she was learning from Granny with regards to the Heartberry teachings, and going in detail about that. I wasn't going to back down on that one. And I felt it was important to, draw on the historical and contemporary and cultural contexts from my own lived experience to create this narrative with the readers. So it was difficult to hear, because here you are, people, publishers out there are open, they put out these calls all over on Instagram and social media saying, we're open to, stories from Black, Indigenous, and racialized and authors, but then how supportive are they in terms of the way that we write our story work, and to go into a box, right? When I say a box, like, one would strip our cultural knowledge. So I was very fortunate with the publisher that I did land in the end, and it was actually very quick. The turnaround with that one, I was very, very appreciative of it. And one of the first things they said is, we're not going to touch the length. They loved the story. They loved the descriptions and the cultural like the cultural context and such. And to me, I knew that that's when the book found its home, right? Because you don't want to. Your heart is put into this work, and it's not just for writing a story. It's really to share that histories and to become a teaching tool for people, to become a learning tool for people. So it goes beyond just being a story. So I'm very, very grateful to the publisher, to Highwater Press for what they did.
Right. And wrapping up here, I'm curious, do you have a particularly favorite part of the book in this case that you would perhaps like to share with the listeners? And perhaps do you want to read a part in this case, or not really?
I'll actually continue on from I liked the section when the one that you read earlier. It was really my favorite part of that relationship between Granny and Maggie, because it really shows the empathy that's really weaved into it. So I'll probably continue on. I think let's hope that I'm starting at the right spot, but I'll explain why I did pick this particular part of it, though. So many First Nations women spoke out against it. So there were some changes. So I think, sorry, I should say, like, Maggie's asking, I'll start before that. So, like, how could they do that to you? I exclaim. Is there still a law? Is that why you live in the city? Many First Nation women spoke out against it. So there were some changes. Some women who lost their status could apply to get it back, like me. Their children could apply, like your father. And later on, some other generations could apply too, like you, Maggie. Granny explains. Many returned to live in their First Nation communities. Many stayed in cities, like I did. Not everyone got their Indian status back. There are women and children still waiting for change. That's not fair, I say. It wasn't easy for me or our community, but beating, it gives me strength. I stare down at the pile of photos as Granny's words echo in my head. How terrible it must have been for Granny to leave her home. So I really chose that because I think it's the idea of showing that the impact that it really did have in a very short paragraph, right? And how it moved, like that women did speak out against it, that they did resist this. And in the back of the book, it does name, there's a description and it names the women that were involved in that over many years. And it mentions, there were some changes, and it kind of describes who got it back, but it also mentions that there's some people that are still lost in the system, right? And also mentioning, like, at the very end, showing how Maggie, this little girl, can understand and does have empathy for her grandmother who lost it by saying, how terrible it must have been for Granny to leave her home. And, for young children to read this, to also think about how they feel about that when they hear the story, or whoever's reading the story, right? To, how they see that too.
And I do appreciate this mention of the kind of historical act of resistance that did happen, and continues to happen in this case. And I remember it was one of the classes I took on post-colonial literature a few years ago. That was one of the things that the professor brought up, was there was always resistance, right? It was never something that was passively taken. And that's something that's vital to remember, right? Whenever you're approaching any kind of community, in this case, that suffered under colonialism or imperialism, that this resistance always happened, and it impacts how these cultural documents, to use your term in this case, right, are produced and are approached in this case. And I think that's very important for readers to remember in this case. And that's a part of the book that I particularly appreciated as well. Yeah, definitely.
Thank you.
So one of the questions I like to ask whenever I have guests on is, what didn't I ask in this interview? And what's the answer to that question?
I think you've asked a lot in terms of the whole process of the book, and exploring sort of, and recognizing that, issues still exist today. I think about back to when I wrote I Am Not a Number. So, Berry Bling comes out soon in May. And I think it's just, thinking about, for me, I'm not sure if it's a question and how to answer it, but I think for me, it's I'm kind of wondering how it's all going to be received. Like in your questions that you asked, you focus a lot on the gender discrimination, the Indian Act, and I'm so appreciative of that, because that's something that we do need to talk about, and how that has impacted so many thousands of people. and thinking about sort of what conversations might come from a book like this. It's sort of, for me, it's the unknown, right? It's like you don't know how it's received, or how the conversations are taken. But you know what? I really close off the book with, it goes through sort of this flow that talks about like resistance and resilience and perseverance and persistence and but I'm hoping that people also see the Indigenous joy that is expressed in this book, between the relationship between Granny and Maggie and this little girl learning about her culture, the Anishinaabe culture, and a teaching through the Berry Bling, and her finding so much joy in that in the end, even though she was frustrated making those earrings and wanted to stop. That she took the time to listen to the truth, her grandmother's truth, that she took the time to listen to find out the truth of others, their experiences, and then to have this empathy for them, and also recognizing there's people that still sit in silence. And the book closes off this way with bringing together all these teachings. It's almost like a little poem at the end. So I'm hoping people see that this is a little girl in the end who really finds pride in her identity.
Well, thank you very much for answering all of these questions. And can you tell listeners perhaps a bit more about where they might be able to find the book, or how to get into contact with you if they want to ask you particular questions, if that's something that you're open to?
Sure.
Anything like that.
So Berry Bling can be pretty much found through anyone's preferred bookseller, and people can get in touch with me. I do have a website. It's my full name, so it's jennykaydupuis.com, and my email is listed there, so they can reach out if they have any questions or want to reach out for any other reasons.
And so I can't thank you enough for this wonderful interview. Thank you very much for your time, and I wish you all the success for future projects in this case, whether they're children's literature or short stories, whatever else is in the works in this case, and all the success for this release.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the time.